A shy girl named Emma Reed didn't believe in fate. She believed in keeping her head down, working hard, and surviving the day without drawing attention. But on a sweltering Tuesday morning, as she stopped to adjust her shirt in the reflection of a dark car window, she had no idea that someone was watching her from the other side of the glass, someone who would change everything she thought she knew about herself, and about the kind of life she deserved. Emma Reed walked with her head slightly down, as if the weight of her past was sewn into her shoulders. The morning sun had already begun to rise high, casting long shadows of street signs and flickering off parked cars. Her jeans were worn thin at the knees, and the faded tank top clung awkwardly to her frame in the early summer heat. She wasn't going anywhere special, just on her way to the diner where she worked the morning shift, but even for that, she wanted to at least look somewhat presentable. She paused on the sidewalk when she saw the sleek black car parked at the corner. It was spotless, a luxury model she couldn't name, the kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood. But it had dark windows, almost like a mirror, and she instinctively stepped closer to fix the strap of her tank top that kept slipping down. Her reflection stared back at her, messy ponytail, faint circles under her eyes, no makeup. She pressed her fingers to her shirt, adjusted it, and for a brief moment, looked into her own eyes. Then she turned and kept walking. What she didn't see was the man sitting inside the car, just beyond the tinted glass. Edward Montgomery hadn't moved. He had been parked there for a while, engine off, his phone face down on the seat beside him. He had no business being here, no scheduled meeting, no real reason to drive through this part of the city. But something about being away from the marble floors and glass elevators of his world made him feel like he could breathe. That morning, he had parked without thinking, just trying to clear his head. And then she appeared. He noticed how she didn't look around to see who was in the car. She didn't pose. She didn't try to look beautiful. She didn't even seem to know how beautiful she was. There was a quiet honesty in the way she stared at her own reflection, almost like she didn't recognize herself. That vulnerability did something to him. He had seen women dressed in diamonds and silk, women who knew exactly how to get his attention. But this girl with second-hand jeans and tired eyes, held his gaze without even trying. By the time Emma disappeared down the street and out of sight, Edward was still sitting motionless, lost in a thought he couldn't name yet. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she mattered. But something inside him shifted. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel numb. Emma's world was built on routine. She woke up at 5:30, made a pot of cheap coffee, tied her hair back without looking in the mirror, and walked the same cracked sidewalk to the diner 6 blocks down. The building was old, the sign missing a few letters, and the smell of burnt toast seemed to linger even after closing. But it was her job, and more than that, it was the only stable thing she had. She had been working there for almost 2 years, ever since she aged out of the last foster home. It wasn't glamorous. She wiped down sticky booths, refilled chipped mugs with watery coffee, and kept her mouth shut when customers called her "sweetheart" like it was her name. Most nights, after her shift, she took the bus across town to a cramped community college where she was slowly, painfully, working toward a nursing degree. Some nights she fell asleep on the bus and missed her stop. Some nights she sat through class with aching feet and an empty stomach. But she kept going. Not because she believed in happy endings, but because doing nothing was worse. Her past clung to her like a second skin. Her mother had died of an overdose when Emma was 13, right there on the floor of the one-bedroom apartment they shared with 2 other families. The memory of calling for help, her hands shaking so hard she could barely dial, still lived in the corners of her mind. After that came the system, foster homes, temporary shelters, counselors who asked too many questions, and foster parents who wanted the paycheck more than the child. Trust was not something Emma gave easily. In fact, she didn't give it at all. That's why, when she noticed the same black car passing the diner twice in one morning, her stomach turned. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Some rich guy got lost. Maybe a business meeting nearby. But when she caught the same sleek car again later that afternoon, parked across the street while she took the trash out back, her instincts sharpened. She knew what it felt like to be watched, even if she didn't understand why someone would be watching her now. She didn't say anything to anyone at the diner. She never did. She just tightened her ponytail, pulled her hoodie tighter around her frame, and told herself to stay alert. Her world didn't allow for fairy tales or strange encounters that ended well. In her experience, people didn't just appear in your life unless they wanted something. And no one ever wanted something without a cost. So she kept her eyes down, her step steady, and her heart locked away where no one could reach it. Even if someone was watching, even if something was about to change, Emma had learned long ago that hope was dangerous. It made you soft. And soft didn't survive. Edward had never been one to fixate on strangers. His life was built on efficiency, structure, and distraction, meetings that bled into more meetings, curated social circles, scheduled calls, and carefully managed appearances. But something about that girl, the way she looked into the car window like it was the only mirror she had carved a space in his mind that he couldn't ignore. He kept returning to that block, not every day at first, but enough to make himself wonder what the hell he was doing. He told his assistant he needed time away from the office, claimed he was researching investment opportunities in urban renewal projects, even though he didn't believe in lying. He just didn't want to explain what he couldn't understand himself. Every time he drove past that diner, he told himself it was curiosity. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't watching the neighborhood. He was watching her. One afternoon, he sat parked down the block, the car engine humming softly. The windows were tinted enough to hide him, but not so dark that he couldn't see her through the glass. She stepped outside in her uniform, black pants, a plain shirt with a faded name tag, and dragged 2 heavy trash bags toward the alley behind the building. He noticed how she moved like she was used to doing everything herself, like no one had ever offered to help. There was something painfully ordinary about her, but in that ordinariness, he saw something extraordinary. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and that made her unforgettable. He asked his driver, Marcus, to find out who she was. Marcus didn't ask why. In their years together, Edward had never asked for anything like this, and the man understood instinctively that this wasn't business. The next day, Marcus handed him a small file with her name, her workplace, and a brief background check. Edward was surprised to learn how little there was. No known family. A few foster homes. A part-time student. Clean record. Quiet life. He could have sent someone to talk to her, arranged something indirect, but he didn't want to play games. That wasn't what this was. So instead, he walked into the diner. The first time, he sat in the back corner and ordered black coffee. She didn't even look at him. She refilled his cup, cleared his plate, wiped the table next to him without saying a word. And still, he stayed. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Always sitting at the same table. Always ordering the same coffee. He watched how she handled rude customers with calm silence, how she offered quiet kindness to the elderly man who came in every Wednesday, how she moved with the careful presence of someone used to being invisible. By the 4th visit, he found himself waiting for her to glance at him, to acknowledge him in some small way. But she never did. And oddly, that only drew him closer. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't curious. She didn't care who he was or why he kept showing up. What he didn't know was that Emma had noticed him the very first time he walked through the door. She noticed everything. She just didn't react. Reacting meant opening the door, and she didn't open doors for anyone. Not anymore. She had no idea who he was, but something about him made her uneasy. He was too calm, too clean, too out of place. And yet, there was something familiar in the way he looked at her, like he was searching for something he'd already lost. Neither of them knew it yet, but something irreversible had already begun. On the 5th day, Emma couldn't take it anymore. The same man, the same table, the same quiet stares, it was starting to gnaw at her. She wasn't easily spooked, not after everything she'd lived through, but this was different. He wasn't creepy, he wasn't pushy, he wasn't doing anything wrong. And maybe that was what made it worse. He was just there. Always watching, never speaking. She approached his table with the coffee pot in hand, refilling his half-empty cup without asking. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were sharp when she finally broke the silence. "Did you lose something here?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "You've been sitting in that same spot for 5 days straight." The man looked up at her slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes didn't match the smile. There was something heavy in them, something quiet and searching. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I found it." Emma rolled her eyes and turned to walk away, but something about the way he said it, soft, sincere, not flirtatious, made her hesitate. She glanced over her shoulder, almost against her will. He didn't try to follow her or say anything else. He just sipped his coffee and looked back out the window like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. Later that day, when she stepped outside for her 10-minute break, she found him leaning against the wall near the diner's entrance. He had no coffee, no phone, no agenda. Just his hands in his pockets and that same quiet expression. "I'm not here to bother you," he said before she could speak. I like talking to you." Even if it was only one sentence. Emma folded her arms across her chest. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I'd like to." She shook her head, more amused than annoyed now. "That line probably works better in whatever part of town you're from." "I didn't mean it as a line." His voice was steady, unpolished. "I meant it exactly the way I said it." She studied him for a long second, unsure if he was insane or just stubborn. He didn't look like a liar. He didn't look like anything, really, just a man who somehow didn't fit his own face. "Look," he said, stepping back. "No pressure. No games. Just, if you ever feel like getting some air, I know a place nearby that serves better coffee than this one." She arched an eyebrow. "You've been drinking this coffee all week." He smiled, this time with something real behind it. "Exactly." That night, she didn't go with him. But she thought about it. And the next day, when he showed up again and simply nodded at her without expectation, she felt a strange flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, something close to curiosity. By the third time he asked, she said yes. Not because she trusted him, not because she wanted anything from him, but because something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, not every door led to pain. Some doors just led to fresh air. Their first walk was quiet. Not the kind of awkward silence that begged to be filled, but something more natural, like two people sharing space without needing to explain why. They strolled through a park just a few blocks away from the diner, where the trees leaned low over the cracked paths and the benches were faded from years of sun and rain. Emma didn't speak much, and Edward didn't push. He seemed to understand instinctively that pressure would only drive her away. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets, occasionally glancing over as if to make sure she was still there, still real. When she finally spoke, it wasn't small talk. She asked him what he did for a living, and he hesitated. For a moment, he considered telling the truth, that he was the CEO of Montgomery Holdings, that he sat at the head of boardroom tables most people would never see. But something in her eyes made him take a different path. "I used to run a company," he said carefully. "Right now I'm trying to remember who I was before that." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Emma didn't seem surprised or curious. She just nodded, as if she understood what it meant to lose pieces of yourself along the way. Over the next couple of weeks, their walks became routine. They never planned them. He would stop by the diner after her shift, wait outside without saying a word, and if she felt like joining, she would. If not, he would simply nod and leave. That was the deal. No pressure. No questions. Just presence. During those walks, she started to open up. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, like someone testing the weight of a locked box before handing over the key. She told him about the first night she spent in a foster home, how she had slept with her shoes on because she didn't know if she'd have to run. She told him how she used to read medical textbooks in the library because she couldn't afford internet or classes, how she once saved a neighbor from an overdose and that was the moment she realized she wanted to be a nurse. Her voice was calm when she said these things, like she'd learned long ago that pain had to be handled like glass, gently, or not at all. Edward listened more than he spoke. When he did talk, it wasn't about money or power or business. He talked about his brother, who had died in a car crash when they were teenagers, about how his parents stopped looking at each other after that, and how the silence in their mansion had been louder than any scream. He told her how success felt like climbing a mountain that never ended, how every accomplishment left him feeling more hollow, not less. And how she, this girl from nowhere, made him feel something solid under his feet for the first time in years. There was no romance in those first days, no touching or flirting. Just two people slowly unfolding their bruised histories under the dim light of street lamps and quiet skies. But something deeper was building, something rooted in truth, not fantasy. Emma didn't trust easily, and Edward didn't expect her to. But with every walk, every shared silence, every honest word, the walls she had built so carefully began to shift, just slightly. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if it was possible to be seen, not as a burden, not as a project, but as herself. It happened on a Thursday evening, the air heavy with the promise of rain. They had walked farther than usual, ending up at a quiet overlook above the city where the lights blinked like distant stars. Emma sat on a low concrete wall, her hands curled around a paper cup of tea he had bought from a street vendor, and for the first time in weeks, she looked relaxed. Her shoulders weren't pulled up tight. Her eyes weren't scanning the horizon for threats. She looked at peace, or at least close to it. Edward had been thinking about this moment for days. The truth pressed against his ribs like a stone in his chest, and each time he looked at her, it grew heavier. He had told himself that he needed more time, that she wasn't ready to know, but deep down he knew that was a lie. The longer he kept it from her, the more it would feel like betrayal. So he took a breath and spoke, not with the confidence he usually carried, but with quiet vulnerability. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, watching the way her eyes sharpened in an instant. "Something important. About who I am." Emma didn't move, but her posture changed. Subtle. Defensive. She placed the cup beside her on the wall and crossed her arms, but she didn't interrupt. "My name is Edward Montgomery," he continued. "I own a company, Montgomery Holdings. It's big. Probably the kind of company you've heard of without knowing who runs it. And I didn't come to that diner by accident. I saw you one morning and I came back because I wanted to know who you were." The silence that followed was complete. Not a single breeze moved the leaves. Emma didn't speak, didn't blink. For a moment, he wondered if she was breathing at all. She finally stood up, slow and deliberate, and took 2 steps back from him. Her face didn't show anger, not yet, but there was something harder than anger in her eyes. Disappointment. Distance. "So this was all some kind of game?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. "You just decided to drop into my life because you were bored?" "No. Emma, it wasn't like that." "Don't," she snapped, and suddenly the calm was gone. "Don't say my name like you have the right to it." He tried to explain. He told her he didn't plan for any of it, that he hadn't expected to feel anything, that meeting her had changed him in ways he didn't have words for. But she wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't even looking at him. Her hands were shaking, not with rage, but with that old, familiar instinct, to run. "I let you in," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't do that. I don't let people in. I know. And I didn't want to lie." "But you did," she said, her voice flat now. You watched me. You found out who I was without asking. That's not honesty. That's control. He reached out, not to grab her, just to be closer, but she stepped back again, and the look on her face made his chest ache. I thought you were someone like me, she said. But you're just another rich guy playing with something you don't understand. And then she was gone. She didn't look back. She didn't give him a chance to follow. One moment, she was standing there with the city lights behind her. The next, all that remained was the paper cup still sitting on the wall, growing cold in the dark. For weeks, Emma disappeared. She didn't just stop answering texts or ignore his calls, she vanished. The number she'd used was disconnected. Her social media, what little there had been, was gone. She wasn't at the diner anymore, and when Edward asked the manager, all he got was a shrug and a quick, she quit. No forwarding address, no explanation. She had erased herself, and she had done it well. At first, Edward told himself to respect her decision. He had hurt her, even if unintentionally, and she had every right to walk away. But each morning he woke up hoping to see her name flash on his phone, and each night he stayed awake wondering where she was. It wasn't guilt that haunted him, it was absence. The silence she left behind echoed louder than any fight they could have had. He went back to the street where they'd first met, the cracked sidewalk and that old mirror-like car window that had started everything. He parked nearby, just sat there, wondering how a moment so small could have turned into something so massive. He found himself retracing their walks, standing at the corners they'd paused on, sitting on the bench where she once told him about saving her neighbor. He replayed her words in his head over and over, and the more he thought about them, the more he realized how much of her trust had been built on honesty, something he had violated without fully meaning to. He wanted to write her a letter. Not an email, not a text. Something slower, something real. So he did. He sat at the kitchen table in his penthouse, a place that had never felt more hollow, and wrote with a pen like he hadn't done in years. His handwriting was uneven, and the words didn't come easily, but he didn't stop until the page was filled. He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't make promises. He just told her the truth, everything he hadn't said when he had the chance. That he had watched her at first because he didn't understand what he was feeling. That he had lied by omission and regretted it every day since. That meeting her had been the only thing in his life that had felt unscripted and real, and even if she never forgave him, he would always carry the version of himself she had helped him discover. He mailed the letter to the one place he could think of, the rundown apartment complex across town where Marcus had once tracked her roommate's name. There was no guarantee she'd get it, no way to know if it would even reach her. But it was the only thread he had left. Days passed. Then a week. Then another. No reply. No sign. Then one evening, just as the sun began to slip beneath the skyline, Edward went back to the place where it all began, the spot on the sidewalk where she had once adjusted her tank top in the car's reflection, never knowing someone was watching. He sat on a nearby bench, hands folded, no expectations, just presence. She wasn't there. He stayed until the streetlights buzzed to life and the shadows grew long. He was about to leave when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't turn right away. He didn't want to hope too soon. But then her voice came, quiet but steady. I got your letter. He stood slowly, heart hammering so hard it made his chest feel tight. She was there, a few feet away, wearing a hoodie pulled up around her face, like armor. Her eyes were unreadable, but she hadn't run. Not yet. I didn't know if I should come, she said. But I didn't want to disappear forever, either. He nodded. I'm glad you didn't. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, just once, and it was enough. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her. He just waited, the same way he had when they first started walking side by side. And then, without another word, she sat down next to him on the bench, her arms tucked around her knees. For now, that was enough. A year later, the city looked different. Maybe it was the same cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights, the same rusted fire escapes and distant sirens, but to Emma, everything felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. She walked down the same streets she used to dread with a steadiness in her step she never thought she'd have. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled from a long shift at the clinic, but there was pride in the way she wore them. The name tag on her chest now read Emma Reed, RN, and every time she glanced at it, even by accident, a small part of her healed. The clinic sat on the corner of a block that had once been full of abandoned buildings and empty storefronts. Now, children played on the sidewalks while parents lingered nearby, some of them waiting for free checkups or just stopping by to talk. Inside, the walls were warm tones, not sterile white, and the staff called each other by first names. It wasn't just a clinic, it was a place built on second chances. Edward had sold a portion of Montgomery Holdings to fund the entire operation. It hadn't been a dramatic gesture or an attempt to prove anything. He'd done it because he believed in what she wanted to do, and because he no longer felt tethered to the idea that success meant skyscrapers and stock tickers. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt like a tool rather than a mask. Their relationship hadn't been a fairy tale. There were arguments, long nights of doubt, and days when silence hung between them like a question. But there was also growth, apologies that mattered, and the kind of trust that was earned in slow, deliberate layers. Emma still had her instincts, her wariness, but she no longer lived in survival mode. And Edward had learned how to listen, not just hear. They met each other where they were, not in perfection, but in progress. They never made a big announcement. There was no dramatic proposal or diamond ring in a velvet box. One night, curled up on the couch with takeout containers and a documentary playing in the background, Emma had looked over and said, "I'm not going anywhere, you know." He had smiled, leaned in, and whispered, "Good. Because I'd have followed you anywhere." Sometimes they walked past the place where she had once used his car window as a mirror. The building hadn't changed, but every time they passed it, Emma would glance at the spot and shake her head with a quiet laugh. "I was just fixing my shirt," she'd say, smiling at the absurdity of it all. "And I was just sitting there, avoiding my life," he'd reply. That mirror had better timing than either of us. They didn't need to pretend that everything had been easy. The beauty of their story wasn't in how perfect it was, but in how real it had become. They had come from opposite worlds, carried different wounds, and met in the most unexpected of ways. But somehow, against all odds, they had built something strong, something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. And sometimes, when Emma caught her reflection in a window now, she didn't see the girl who used to flinch from her own gaze. She saw someone steady, someone loved, someone who had finally come home. To me, the beauty of this ending lies in its quietness. It doesn't scream with fairy tale perfection or cinematic fireworks, and that's exactly why it feels real. Emma and Edward's story isn't about rescue, it's about recognition. Two people from wildly different worlds saw past surface and status, past fear and pride, and into the parts of each other that had been overlooked or wounded for too long. What makes the ending powerful is not that they ended up together, but how they did, through slow forgiveness, uncomfortable truths, and the terrifying act of choosing vulnerability after years of building walls. Emma didn't fall into luxury, and Edward didn't abandon his world. They both changed, not for each other, but because of each other. It's a love story, yes, but not the kind where everything is magically fixed. It's the kind where everything is faced. And in that, it becomes something far more lasting. The billionaire CEO was heading home from work, until he saw three little girls asleep in his lobby, clutching a note that changed everything. Brandon Carter had never stayed this late at the office. He usually left before midnight, even on the worst days, but tonight had dragged on, calls with overseas investors, urgent emails, and a board meeting that went in circles for hours. His head throbbed. His tie was loosened, his jacket slung over one shoulder as he stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Carter Holdings, the towering glass symbol of everything he'd built. The lights were dimmed, the building nearly silent. Only the security guard remained, nodding at him from the front desk. Brandon nodded back, already halfway to the exit when he saw them. 3 little girls. Sleeping. They were curled up on the leather couch in the far corner of the lobby, their small bodies close together for warmth, jackets draped over them like blankets. At first, Brandon thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as he moved closer, a strange chill ran through him. The girls were identical, light blonde curls, soft round cheeks, button noses. Twins were rare. Triplets. Almost unheard of. They couldn't be older than 6. They were dressed simply, like they'd been walking for a while. Beside them lay 2 backpacks, slightly worn. One of the girls had a crumpled piece of paper clutched in her tiny hand. Brandon's voice was low when he turned to the security guard. "How long have they been here?" The guard looked unsettled. "They came in around 8. Said they were waiting for their dad. I thought someone would come for them, but no one ever did." Brandon crouched down slowly, careful not to startle them, though none of them stirred. Their faces were peaceful, but their cheeks were flushed from the cold. He gently pulled the piece of paper from the girl's hand and unfolded it. It was a note. The handwriting was uneven, letters large and shaky. It looked like a child had written it with great effort. "If you're reading this, it means Mom didn't come back. We went to where you work. Our names are Mia, Liv, and Amber. Mom said if anything ever happened, we should find you. Because you're our dad." Brandon couldn't move. The name Mom echoed in his head, and so did one other, Hannah. He hadn't heard from her in over 6 years. Their time together had been brief but unforgettable, a summer whirlwind, gone too fast. They'd never officially broken things off, she had just disappeared. No calls. No explanations. He had searched for a while, but eventually convinced himself she had moved on. Maybe he had too. But now, staring at these 3 sleeping children, identical, perfect, and somehow familiar, he felt the ground shift beneath him. They weren't just any children. They looked like him. Not vaguely. Not subtly. The shape of their faces. The curl of their hair. Even their mouths, he recognized his own expression, softened into something small and innocent. He suddenly felt like he was looking into the past, at a life he never knew had continued without him. He sat back slowly, the note still in his hand, heart pounding. There was no doubt anymore. Not with a note like that. Not with faces like theirs. Somewhere in the years since she left, Hannah had given birth to triplets. His triplets. And she was gone. He looked at them again, really looked, how they huddled together, how they had memorized where he worked, how they had waited all evening in hopes that he would walk through those doors. A wave of something crashed over him. Guilt. Shock. Love. And a fear so sharp it stole his breath. They had no one else. And whether he was ready or not, they had found their way to him. Brandon Carter, who had built billion-dollar empires, led thousands, and planned every minute of his life, stood completely unprepared for what came next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away. Brandon carried the girls out of the building himself, one by one. They were still asleep as he gently lifted each of them from the couch, cradling their tiny bodies like porcelain. The security guard watched in stunned silence, not daring to ask questions. Brandon had no answers to give anyway, only instinct screaming that these girls didn't belong alone in a lobby, and that whatever mess this was, it was his to clean up. He didn't take them to his penthouse. That place, polished, silent, full of glass and cold space, felt wrong. Instead, he drove to the house he hadn't set foot in for years, the one he grew up in, tucked away on a quiet street outside the city. The home had been empty since his mother passed, but it still held warmth, old furniture, faded rugs, and walls that remembered laughter. It was the closest thing to comfort he could offer them on such short notice. He laid them down together in the guest room, side by side on the old double bed, pulling soft blankets over their small bodies. They didn't stir, just curled closer to one another out of habit. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at them, still holding the note. "Because you're our dad." The words hadn't stopped ringing in his head since he read them. Brandon barely slept. He sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the ceiling, trying to recall every detail of his time with Hannah. Their connection had been sudden and fierce, two people crashing into each other at the wrong time. She was brilliant, passionate, and impossible to pin down. He had wanted more, but she had vanished before he could ask for it. Now, he wondered if she had been scared. Or sick. Or both. By morning, he brewed coffee with a machine so old he wasn't sure it still worked. The smell filled the air just as small footsteps echoed down the hallway. One of the girls, Mia, he thought, peeked around the corner. She wore an oversized hoodie that slipped past her hands and rubbed her eyes like she had just woken from a dream. Brandon knelt. "Hi," he said softly. She looked at him, hesitant but not frightened. "Are you Brandon?" she asked. He nodded. "Then you're our dad," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Behind her, the other two appeared, Liv, slightly more reserved, with serious eyes, and Amber, who immediately made a beeline for the couch and climbed up like she'd always lived there. They all had the same eyes. His eyes. That fact struck him again, hard. He tried to find the words. "Do you know what happened to your mom?" Mia nodded solemnly. "She got really sick. She said it wasn't going away. We stayed with her a long time. Then one night she told us if she didn't wake up, we should go find you." Liv added, "She told us exactly where to go. We had it written on a card. Your building." Brandon felt like someone had punched the air from his lungs. "You memorized the address?" "She made us repeat it every night before bed," Mia said, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "She said you were a good man. Just, busy." That one word, busy, cut deeper than any accusation ever could. He didn't ask why Hannah hadn't reached out to him. He didn't ask why she hadn't told him about the pregnancy. Those questions didn't matter now. What mattered was that three girls had walked through city streets, into a corporate tower they'd never seen, and waited all night in hopes that someone would recognize them. And he had. He made them pancakes, bad ones, slightly burned, but they didn't complain. They ate at the old wooden table with their legs swinging, giggling at how much syrup Brandon poured on his own plate. After breakfast, they explored the house like it was some kind of adventure park. They opened every drawer, peeked behind every door. There was no fear in their curiosity, just resilience and hunger for a place to belong. By the end of the day, the house felt alive again. It smelled like maple syrup and shampoo. The sound of footsteps echoed upstairs, mixed with singing and the quiet rustle of pages from a bedtime storybook. Brandon sat on the edge of the couch later that night, the note beside him, a cup of untouched tea in his hand. He didn't have a plan. He had no idea what came next. But for the first time in his life, uncertainty didn't feel like failure. It felt like beginning. He looked down the hallway toward the room where the girls now slept, three matching shapes under one big blanket, and whispered to himself, "You found me." And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Brandon spent the next morning making phone calls he never imagined he would have to make. His usual day would begin with a sharp, scheduled rhythm, meetings, updates, numbers, deals. But this time, instead of sitting in his corner office, he was at the kitchen table in a faded hoodie, researching family lawyers and child custody specialists while one of the girls, Liv, braided her sister's hair in the living room and asked if they could have peanut butter for lunch. He had told himself he was a man who could handle anything. He had closed billion-dollar deals, navigated global crises, fired entire departments with a straight face. But none of it had prepared him for waking up as a father of three overnight. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, equal parts terrified and strangely anchored. Every time he looked at them, Mia's curious stare, Liv's quiet intensity, Amber's bursts of laughter, he saw his own face refracted back through 3 tiny mirrors. It wasn't something he could ignore or walk away from. The bond was unspoken, but undeniable. The lawyer he hired was named Mary Ann Lewis. She had a calm, clear voice and didn't flinch when Brandon told her everything, from the note to the couch in the lobby to the fact that he hadn't known Hannah had children. Mary Ann took it all in without judgment. She explained the legal process step by step. Without a will from Hannah and no living family members stepping forward yet, Brandon could apply for emergency guardianship, then pursue full custody once paternity was confirmed. But that word, paternity, lingered in the air like an accusation. He didn't need a test to know. Still, the law required proof, so he agreed. He drove the girls to the clinic 2 days later. They didn't ask many questions. Amber wanted to know if it would hurt. Mia held her hand. Liv didn't say a word, but she sat closest to him in the waiting room, her shoulder pressed lightly against his. Back at home, Brandon tried to create a routine. They started with simple things. Breakfast at the same time. Walks around the block after dinner. He enrolled them in a nearby school under temporary status, met with the principal, explained just enough without revealing too much. He bought them new clothes that actually fit and let them pick out their favorite cereals and toothbrushes. Some nights were harder. Liv had nightmares and wouldn't talk about them. Mia asked him if he had ever been a dad before. Amber once cried when she found a photo of Hannah in one of the boxes they had brought. Brandon never pretended to have the right answers. Instead, he sat with them, held them, read them stories, and promised, over and over, that he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Mary Ann called with the results. The test confirmed what he already knew. He was their biological father. The paperwork would now begin to shift, and the courts would move forward with the custody process. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like gravity. He sat alone on the front porch that night, the cool air brushing against his face. The house behind him was filled with soft breathing, stuffed animals, the occasional creak of floorboards. It was no longer a quiet place. It was a home, messy and alive. He looked up at the stars and thought of Hannah. He wondered how she had managed all of it, carrying 3 children, raising them, preparing them for a life without her. She had been braver than he ever realized. He whispered her name into the dark, not expecting an answer. But inside, in the spaces he used to fill with noise and numbers, something had shifted. He didn't know what kind of father he would be. He only knew that he would try. Every single day. And for the first time in years, trying felt like enough. Brandon was beginning to understand that fatherhood wasn't about grand gestures. It was about being there, again and again, even when you didn't know what you were doing. The house that once stood in silence now echoed with life. The girls brought color to every corner. They argued over who got the last blueberry muffin, left muddy footprints in the hallway, and insisted on using glitter for everything, including homework. Every day brought a new challenge, Mia's curiosity about everything, Liv's quiet sensitivity, Amber's wild energy that could turn calm into chaos in under 5 minutes. Brandon was exhausted in ways he had never experienced, but he also felt more alive than he had in years. He started doing school drop-offs in the morning, walking them to class with their small hands gripping his fingers. Teachers gave him polite, curious looks. Other parents, who recognized him from television or business magazines, often stared or whispered. He ignored it. These weren't the circles he had once belonged to, and he didn't care. At home, he helped with math problems that confused him, cooked meals that were occasionally edible, and learned the lyrics to songs he never thought he'd hear outside a toy commercial. One Thursday afternoon, he was late picking them up. A meeting with his lawyer had run over, and traffic was a nightmare. When he finally arrived, he found the girls sitting on the school steps, backpacks in their laps. Mia looked worried, Liv was silent, and Amber's face was crumpled in frustration. They didn't speak as they got into the car. The silence hurt more than any accusation could have. Back at home, Brandon knelt beside them in the kitchen. "I messed up," he said honestly. "I should have been here on time. That won't happen again." He waited. Liv finally looked at him. "You were the only one not there." "I know," he replied quietly. "I'm sorry." Amber mumbled, "Mom was always late too." Something in that broke him. It wasn't anger they had felt, it was fear. Fear of being forgotten, of being second again. He made a promise that night. Not just to be better, but to let them see that even grown-ups fail, and that showing up after the mistake mattered just as much as never making one at all. As the weeks passed, the rhythm between them grew more natural. Brandon began recognizing their subtle signals, when Liv needed quiet, when Mia needed space to talk, when Amber needed to run wild until she laughed herself breathless. They started including him in their rituals, Saturday morning dance-offs in the living room, Sunday night storytelling under a blanket fort. One night, while brushing their teeth, Amber looked up at him in the mirror and asked, "Are you gonna stay forever?" He met her eyes and nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Later that same week, a package arrived at the house. No return address. Inside was a simple box with Hannah's handwriting on a note, "For when the time is right." Brandon opened it slowly, unsure what he'd find. Inside were old photos, ultrasound images, a small stuffed elephant, and a flash drive. He plugged it in and found a video. Hannah's face appeared on the screen, smiling through tired eyes. She looked older than he remembered, worn down, but still beautiful, still her. She spoke softly. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. And it means they found you. Brandon. I didn't want to leave them without knowing. I didn't want you to find out like this. But I need you to believe me, I always wanted to tell you. I just didn't know how. I was scared. You were busy. I wasn't sure you'd want this." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "They are everything good in this world. Please love them. Not out of duty, but because you see them for who they are. You were the only person I ever trusted with my heart. And I hope, somehow, you'll trust them with yours." When the video ended, Brandon sat in silence for a long time, the girls' laughter faint from the next room. He didn't cry, not because he wasn't broken, but because something inside him was already rebuilding. He tucked the elephant into Amber's bed that night. He framed the ultrasound and hung it in the hallway. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would be there for all of it. He was no longer surviving in this life. He was becoming part of it. Brick by brick, moment by moment, he was building a family, not because he had to, but because he wanted nothing more. The fifth week brought a quiet shift in the way the girls looked at Brandon. It wasn't anything dramatic, there was no grand confession or emotional outburst. It was in the small things, the casual way they began to reach for his hand without hesitation, the way they saved their best stories from school until he was home to hear them, the way their faces lit up when he walked through the door. It was in the trust that didn't have to be spoken anymore. The house had changed, too. It no longer felt like a space he was borrowing to figure things out. It was messy now, and full of sound. There were glitter stains in the carpet, a pile of unmatched socks that never seemed to shrink, and drawings taped up on every available wall surface, most of them of the four of them, Brandon always with a tie, the girls in identical dresses, and a son with a smiley face beaming over them. One evening, Mia lost her favorite stuffed bunny and dissolved into tears that didn't make sense to Brandon at first. It wasn't just about the toy. It was exhaustion, grief, confusion, maybe even fear that something else would disappear next. He didn't try to fix it. He sat with her on the floor, quietly combing through toy bins and under couches until they found the bunny wedged behind a bookshelf. She didn't say thank you. She just hugged it tightly and fell asleep curled up next to him on the rug. That moment did something to him. There was no reward, no performance, just presence. It was the first time he fully understood what it meant to parent through emotion rather than logistics. Liv, still the most guarded of the three, had started asking more questions. Sometimes she would sit at the table with her drawing pad and suddenly ask things like, "What did my mom sound like when she laughed?" Or, "Did you know she liked to eat cereal at night?" Brandon never had all the answers. But he answered what he could, and when he didn't know, he asked Lauren, Hannah's oldest friend, who had begun visiting more often to help fill in the blanks. Liv never responded right away, but hours later she'd sometimes leave a new drawing on his nightstand, or quietly slip her hand into his as they crossed the street. That was her way of saying she was listening. Amber, the wild one, had claimed the living room as her performance stage. She turned furniture into props, played loud music, and made up dances that made no sense but delighted her sisters. One night, after a particularly chaotic dinner where spaghetti had ended up on the ceiling, she stood on the coffee table and declared, "You're officially our dad now. We voted." Then she added, "But you still can't cook." Brandon laughed harder than he had in months. Not because it was funny, though it was, but because for the first time, it felt real. The walls weren't just painted. The space wasn't just filled. He belonged here. They wanted him here. Later that week, the final paperwork came through. Full custody was granted. The court had reviewed everything, his paternity, the girl's situation, the video from Hannah. Brandon had expected to feel relief, but what he felt was heavier. Not bad, just immense. Like someone had handed him a life he never asked for, and now he couldn't imagine breathing without it. He signed the documents in silence, then tucked the final copy into the drawer beside his bed. It was official. But the girls had already decided long before any judge. That night, he cooked dinner, badly, and burned the garlic bread again. The girls teased him the whole time, but no one complained. Afterward, they curled up on the couch with blankets and popcorn, watching an animated movie none of them finished because Amber fell asleep halfway through and Liv followed 5 minutes later. Mia tried to stay awake but leaned against his side and closed her eyes mid-sentence. Brandon stayed like that for a long time, arms around them, the quiet hum of the television in the background. He didn't think about work. He didn't think about the empire he had stepped away from. He thought about Hannah. About how much she had trusted him without ever telling him. About how much he wished he could tell her that he hadn't walked away this time. That he had stayed. That he would keep staying. And that, somehow, he was learning to be the man she believed he could be. The calm they had built began to unravel one Tuesday morning, not with a fight or a tantrum, but with a letter. It was waiting in the mailbox, thick and official-looking, with no return address. Brandon opened it in the kitchen while the girls were still brushing their teeth, expecting school forms or legal follow-ups. Instead, he read the words slowly, carefully, like they were in a different language. It was a legal notice, an intent to pursue custody filed by a man claiming to be Hannah's brother. Jason Walters. A name Brandon had never heard. The man had been recently released from prison and was petitioning the court for guardianship, citing family ties and concern over the children's environment. He wanted the girls. All 3 of them. Brandon stood there in silence, gripping the paper until his knuckles turned white. The kitchen was suddenly too quiet. He didn't know what terrified him more, that this man existed at all, or that he had waited until now to appear. When the girls came in, still arguing over which cartoon character was funnier, he smiled and tucked the letter beneath a pile of newspapers. He didn't want to scare them. Not yet. He called Marianne immediately. Her voice stayed calm, but he could hear the tension behind her words. Legally, it was a complication. Jason was blood, and while his criminal history would be taken into account, courts often looked at biological family first when guardianship was questioned. Marianne warned that the media might latch onto the story. Brandon's past, his wealth, even the fact that he had only recently come into the girls' lives, it would all be used against him. Public opinion didn't always follow logic. The story practically wrote itself. Billionaire businessman with a checkered past of privilege suddenly raises 3 unknown daughters while the real family fights for a voice. Brandon sat on the edge of his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had changed so fast. The house, once full of warmth and laughter, felt fragile again, as if the joy they had built could be pulled away by a single courtroom signature. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. The girls sensed the tension, even though he hadn't told them anything. Liv asked if something was wrong. Mia kept hugging him tighter than usual. Amber clung to his side at night, as if she knew he might disappear. That crushed him more than any legal threat could. They had just started to believe in safety. He couldn't let that belief fall apart. Marianne filed a countermotion. She built a case using everything: his established custody, the school reports, therapist evaluations, even Hannah's video. They documented how stable the girls had become, how involved Brandon was in their daily life, how there had been no contact from Jason until now. She warned him that the case might still go to court. Jason's lawyers were aggressive, and they were playing the media card, painting Brandon as a man playing house with children he barely knew, trying to repair a broken public image with the illusion of fatherhood. That night, Brandon did something he hadn't done in a long time. He cried. Not out of fear for himself, but because he didn't know how to protect the girls from the world beyond their door. He had built companies, silenced competitors, and handled crises with ruthless precision, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of not being able to shield your child from something you couldn't control. Eventually, the court hearing was scheduled. Brandon told the girls the truth in the most careful way he could. He explained that someone had come forward, someone from their mother's past, who believed he should be the one taking care of them. Amber's eyes widened. Mia looked confused. Liv went completely still and then asked a single question: do we get to choose? Brandon swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. You get to tell the truth. That's all I ask. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom felt colder than it should have. Jason sat on the opposite side, clean-shaven and dressed in a borrowed suit, a lawyer at his side who spoke with performative concern. He claimed Brandon wasn't fit to raise the girls, said he had manipulated the system with money and influence, and that Hannah would have wanted her children raised by family. Brandon said very little in response. He didn't need to defend himself with words. He let the evidence speak, and more importantly, he let the girls speak. Each of them sat with a child advocate, one at a time, and answered simple questions about their life, their routines, how they felt at home. Liv said, he doesn't try to replace Mom. He just tries to be here. Mia said, he burned pancakes once and we laughed all morning. Amber said, he picks me up when I fall asleep in the car. Always. When the judge ruled in Brandon's favor, it wasn't with a speech or a dramatic moment. It was quiet. Calm. Final. Jason's petition was denied. Brandon's guardianship was reaffirmed. The girls were safe. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Mia asked if they could go for ice cream. Amber jumped at the idea, and Liv just nodded with quiet relief. Brandon agreed, even though his hands were still shaking. Sitting at a table with 3 bowls of ice cream melting too fast, he watched the girls laugh and fight over toppings, and realized something profound. This wasn't just about keeping them safe. It was about keeping them whole. And in doing so, he was finding pieces of himself that he never knew were missing. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, everything around Brandon began to slow down, not in the sense of stagnation, but in the way life does when you finally step off the edge of a cliff and land somewhere soft. For the first time since the girls arrived, he felt the weight of constant worry ease slightly from his shoulders. He wasn't naive, he knew life would still bring challenges. But the threat of losing them was gone, and that changed everything. There was no more hesitation in his steps, no more doubt when he tucked them in at night. They were his, and more importantly, he was theirs. The girls settled back into routine quickly, as if they had been holding their breath all this time and could finally exhale. Brandon noticed that Amber laughed louder now, her high-pitched giggle echoing through the house without restraint. Liv, who used to double-check that he was still in the room, began disappearing into her reading nook for hours, comfortable enough to lose herself in fantasy. Mia started writing stories, short, chaotic adventures that always featured a brave father with a map and a flashlight, leading his daughters through enchanted forests or lost cities. Brandon kept each one in a box by his desk, rereading them late at night when the house was quiet. Their home became a real home. Brandon redecorated the girls' bedroom, letting them pick paint colors and wall stickers. The result was a riot of stars, rainbows, and unicorns that made no design sense but brought joy to everyone who walked in. He set up a bookshelf with Hannah's old novels and filled it with the girls' favorite picture books. He repaired the creaky front steps and planted flowers with them in the backyard, even though none of them really knew how to garden. It didn't matter. Everything they did together stitched them tighter as a family. Brandon also began to re-enter the world, but on his own terms. He met with the board of Carter Holdings and formally declined any offer to return. The company he'd built no longer reflected who he was. Instead, he poured his energy into something new, a foundation named after Hannah, dedicated to supporting single parents and helping children in transition. It wasn't about charity for him. It was personal. He knew what it meant now to be overwhelmed, unprepared, and scared but still show up. He wanted to create something that could show up for others the way he had learned to do. The foundation's launch was quiet. No press, no flashy gala. He invited a few close friends and colleagues, but most of the room was filled with parents, counselors, and volunteers. During his speech, Brandon didn't talk about success or finance or legacy. He talked about a note left in a little girl's hand, and what it meant to be chosen, not because of money, not because of image, but because someone believed you had the heart to love when it wasn't easy. That night, back home, he sat on the floor of the living room while the girls piled stuffed animals on his lap. They were preparing for the great teddy bear sleepover, a chaotic ritual that now took place every Friday evening. The air was warm, the lights dimmed low, and the smell of buttered popcorn clung to the walls. Mia curled into his side. Liv lay across a beanbag chair, humming. Amber stood on the couch and gave a dramatic speech to the stuffed crowd about bravery and bedtime. Brandon watched them all and felt a calm he couldn't describe, something deeper than pride, more enduring than happiness. Later, when the girls were asleep, he stood by their bedroom doorway, arms crossed over his chest, taking it all in. He no longer felt like a man who had been ambushed by parenthood. He didn't feel like he was catching up to a life that had raced ahead of him. He felt grounded. Present. Aware that he had made mistakes, arrived late, fumbled his way through, but also that he had stayed. That staying, showing up again and again, had slowly transformed everything. The house, the girls, himself. He thought of Hannah often. Sometimes he imagined her sitting across from him on the porch, watching the sunset, nodding in approval without saying a word. Other times, he heard her laugh in Amber's voice or saw her courage in Liv's steady eyes. There were moments he missed her so sharply it stole the air from his lungs, but mostly he felt grateful, for the time they'd had, and for the part of her that remained alive in their daughters. Brandon Carter had built many things in his life. Companies, reputations, wealth. But nothing he had ever created compared to what he was building now, a home made of memories, trust, and quiet, persistent love. And in that home, he had finally found the kind of life that couldn't be measured in dollars, only in bedtime stories, missed shoes in the hallway, and the certainty that he was no longer running from something, but running toward it. Spring arrived in the quietest of ways, soft rain tapping against windows, tiny green buds pushing through the soil in the backyard the girls had helped Brandon plant. The air felt lighter somehow, like the entire house had finally exhaled. It had been almost a year since the night he found them sleeping in the lobby, and yet that memory remained so vivid in his mind it could have happened yesterday. He still saw their small bodies curled together, the crumpled note in Mia's hand, and the ache in his chest when he realized they had come to find him, not as a plan but as a last hope. And now, almost without noticing, that desperate beginning had become a full, breathing life. The house had changed with the season. It was brighter, not because of the sun, but because of what filled it: drawings on the fridge, dance music in the afternoons, the scent of cinnamon waffles on weekends, and the thudding of feet running down the hallway every morning. The girls had grown in ways he hadn't expected. Mia had taken up writing stories, and she now read them aloud before bed, often inserting versions of herself and her sisters as queens, pirates, or astronauts. Liv had learned how to cook eggs exactly the way she liked them and insisted on making breakfast every Sunday. Amber had lost her first tooth and refused to let Brandon throw it away, keeping it in a glittery box she labeled, "My Strength." Brandon had grown too, though no one talked about it. He had learned how to braid hair without YouTube, how to mend scraped knees with calm words instead of panic, and how to apologize when he lost his temper. He had learned that parenting wasn't about knowing what to do, it was about loving them enough to keep trying, even when you were tired, even when you were scared. The girls' school was holding its annual spring concert, and this time, all three of them were performing. It was the first time they'd shared the stage. Mia had a poem to recite, Liv was in the choir, and Amber, naturally, had signed up to dance. Brandon arrived early and sat in the front row, a bouquet of flowers on the seat beside him and a nervous buzz in his chest. As the lights dimmed, he looked around the room, parents chatting, teachers bustling, a row of students whispering and fidgeting in costume. It struck him then, more than ever, how different his life was now. Not smaller, not less important, just entirely real. When the girls appeared on stage, Brandon could barely breathe. They stood under the lights, their small figures brave and steady, and he felt like the world had stopped for just a second. Mia's voice shook a little as she read her poem, but when she caught his eye in the crowd, she straightened. Liv sang clearly, her voice blending with the others, but her eyes never wandered far from where he sat. Amber, dressed in a makeshift costume with sparkly shoes, danced with abandon, throwing her arms wide like she was flying. He clapped so loudly when it was over that people turned to look, but he didn't care. He wasn't clapping just for their performance. He was clapping for everything they had survived together. After the concert, they ran to him, their faces flushed and beaming. He knelt and wrapped his arms around them, flowers crushed between them all. "You were amazing," he said. "Every single one of you." Amber immediately asked if they could get ice cream. Liv rolled her eyes but smiled. Mia asked if he'd recorded her poem. He had. Later that night, after the sugar rush had faded and they had all fallen asleep, Brandon stood alone in the hallway. The house was quiet again, but not in the way it used to be. The silence now was full of presence, not absence. He walked into the girls' room and stood there for a moment, just watching. They were sprawled in different directions, one hugging a pillow, another tangled in a blanket, the third holding a flashlight she had forgotten to turn off. He stepped back into the hallway and looked at the photo they had framed together, one of the first they had taken as a family. In it, all four of them were laughing, mid-motion, unposed and imperfect. Next to it was a small shadow box. Inside was the note Mia had carried that night in the lobby. He had preserved it carefully, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what had been found. Brandon didn't need the world to see what he had built. There was no press, no headlines. Just a man who had once lived in silence and now stood in a home filled with light. He had found purpose not in power, but in presence. Not in control, but in surrender. Not in answers, but in the willingness to stay and grow and love with everything he had. And in that moment, he finally understood, sometimes the greatest thing you ever build is the life you never planned to live. To me, the ending of this story isn't just heartwarming, it's deeply earned. What makes it powerful is that Brandon doesn't get a perfect, dramatic resolution, he gets something much more meaningful, an honest, slow transformation. He doesn't save the girls. They save each other. Through every struggle, every mistake, and every moment of doubt, he chooses to stay, to learn, and to love, not because it's easy or expected, but because it's right. The final chapter is especially moving because it shows that real healing happens not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments, school concerts, bedtime routines, quiet walks through the house at night. Brandon finds joy in the chaos, purpose in the small things, and strength in being vulnerable. By the time we reach the end, he's not a CEO anymore. He's a father. A protector. A man who finally understands that the life he never planned became the one he was always meant to live. And that, in my view, is the most powerful kind of redemption.